I remember that evening with unusual clarity, though the rain had already blurred the edges of memory before it had even begun to settle. Oxford, as always, was both intimate and elusive in the rain, the streets slick with reflections of lamplight that shimmered like liquid gold on the cobblestones. I had been idling in my flat, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and pipe smoke, idly turning the pages of a Bach choir program I had picked up weeks before and never opened. The music itself seemed distant, half-remembered, a lingering echo in an otherwise ordinary day, yet there was something about the neat, precise notations and the careful annotations in the margins that arrested my attention. Lewis rang, his voice faintly hesitant, though he tried to mask it with the casualness he often adopted when conveying matters he believed to be trivial. The lead tenor of St. Barnabas's College Choir, Philip Carmichael, had been found dead in his rooms, apparently of natural causes, though the circumstances so lightly sketched in Lewis's careful phrasing suggested a peculiarity he could not fully articulate. I remember thinking, as I glanced again at the rain-streaked window, that the city had grown quieter somehow, as if the very stones of the colleges had paused to listen. I made my way through the familiar labyrinth of Oxford streets, the damp air clinging to my coat and curling in the small creases of my gloves. The chapel loomed ahead, a sombre silhouette against the muted glow of distant streetlights, its spire pointing upward as if in perpetual questioning. Inside, the choir director, Mrs. Harcourt, stood by the altar, her hands clasped tightly, her expression caught between relief and disbelief. Other members of the choir lingered at the edges, murmuring amongst themselves, glances exchanged with the delicacy of whispered conspiracies. I noticed the subtle way the soprano Eleanor brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear while avoiding my gaze, a gesture I felt mentally, not yet comprehending its significance. The scattered hymn sheets on the lectern drew my attention. One slipped to the floor, a faint crease at its corner. It seemed innocuous, yet the detail lingered as I observed the room. There was a newspaper clipping pinned behind a notice board, its headline sharp and factual, Oxford Choir Tragedy Shocks College Community. The print had curled slightly at the edges as though it, too, had shivered in the damp air. I bent to examine it and found a small notation in pencil at the margin, a single word underlined rehearsal. My fingers lingered over it, and I felt, as I often did, that the smallest detail might unravel what seemed invisible to all others. Lewis, standing just behind me, mentioned the usual who had been present the night before, whether any arguments had been overheard, but my attention drifted to the slight unevenness in Mrs. Harcourt's tone when she spoke of the deceased. A pause here, a mispronunciation there. Each was minor, almost imperceptible, yet they carried the weight of something unspoken. I took a note, silently, with no expectation of immediate understanding, only the quiet certainty that later, perhaps much later, these subtle clues would align. And so the evening began, a distant note, barely audible, yet vibrating faintly through the corridors of memory and stone, hinting at a melody not yet fully composed, a harmony hidden in the ordinary, waiting to be traced. I left the chapel with the rain soft against my collar, the quiet ache of anticipation settling in my chest, and a sense that this case would unfold, not in the rush of action, but in the careful accumulation of whispered truths and overlooked details. The chapel smelled of damp stone and old varnish, a quiet perfume that lingered long after the last footfall. I had always liked St. Barnabas's College Chapel for its restrained elegance, the way its high, narrow windows refracted the dim light into subtle patterns on the worn flagstones. That evening, however, the atmosphere seemed charged with a muted tension, as if the very walls had been listening and had learned to keep secrets. The choir, ordinarily a precise organism of sound and posture, moved in awkward, hesitant formations. They spoke in low murmurs, careful not to disrupt the lingering silence, as though my presence rendered every gesture suspect. Mrs. Harcourt, pale and poised, welcomed us with a fragile smile that did not reach her eyes. She explained that rehearsals had been disrupted in the days leading to Carmichael's death, that notes had been mislaid, and the singers themselves had grown uneasy with one another. I listened not because her words were new, but because the spaces between them often revealed more than the sentences themselves. Eleanor's voice, soft and measured, betrayed subtle unease whenever she spoke of her colleagues, and I noted how her eyes flicked toward the organist with an almost imperceptible sharpness. A glance, a hesitation, a flicker of an expression small enough to be missed, yet substantial if one attended closely. I moved among the pews, observing the music stands, the neatly stacked hymn sheets, and the one that had fallen the night of Carmichael's death, still curling faintly at the edges from damp fingers. There was a subtle irregularity in the arrangement, a treble part reversed, annotations in differing inks, some penciled notes barely legible. I thought of crossword clues, how a single, misprinted letter could mislead a solver here. The notation might mislead anyone who did not pause to notice the discrepancy. Lewis, behind me, made the usual notes about who had been where and when, but I found my attention captured by the gestures, the quiet displacements of hands, and the way certain singers avoided the gaze of others. I questioned the choir members individually, more in reflection than in interrogation. They offered fragments of recollection, each shaped to preserve dignity, or perhaps to conceal an embarrassment or a grievance. One of the tenors mentioned a rehearsal in which Carmichael had seemed distracted, glancing repeatedly at a ledger tucked beneath the piano. Another quieter spoke of an argument over a piece that had been altered without consent. I filed each remark, not seeking immediate understanding, but tracing the invisible threads that connected gesture, word, and intent. The organist, a visiting scholar of considerable reputation, moved with an ease that suggested both authority and careful avoidance. I noticed the slight smudge on his cuff, as if he had brushed against a page or instrument he did not intend to touch, and a subtle inconsistency in his explanation for being alone on the balcony the previous evening. Small things easily dismissed, yet in these minute deviations the outline of truth often begins to emerge. I did not speak to them aloud. The satisfaction lay in observation, in the slow accretion of detail. By the time we departed, the choir had resumed its silent positions, rehearsing the motions more than the music, the air dense with unspoken tension. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving a thin glaze on the quadrangle, the sound of distant bells carrying faintly over the city. I walked alongside Lewis, pondering the choir's peculiar choreography and the subtleties that had gone unnoticed, aware that the truth of Carmichael's final hours would be hidden in the quiet gestures, the notes unsung, and the overlooked pauses that mark the spaces between speech and action. I remember the cloisters that day as a passage between worlds, the arches framing patches of dim light that fell like silver dust across the stone floor. The air was heavy with the scent of damp mortar and aged oak, a quiet permanence that made human anxieties seem both fleeting and inconsequential. I moved slowly toward Carmichael's rooms, the echo of my footsteps mingling with the faint hum of wind through leaded glass, aware that each sound was amplified in the stillness. Lewis followed, taking notes in his discreet, orderly manner, but I was attuned to subtler cues, a door slightly ajar, the hesitation in a footstep, the way the light caught a corner of paper in the shadows. Inside, the room carried the faint perfume of old ink and overripe parchment, as though the manuscripts themselves had absorbed some lingering memory. Carmichael's desk was neat to the point of austerity, a stack of music sheets, a small ink pot, and a brass letter opener, arranged with deliberate precision. I ran my eyes over the letters scattered on the desk, most addressed in familiar hands to colleagues, some unsigned, all carrying the fragrance of carefully restrained emotion. One letter, half hidden beneath a rehearsal score, was written in hurried script, its tone both intimate and strained, referring to a meeting that must not be forgotten and a rehearsal that will not go as planned. I noted the underlined words with a subtle twist of my lips, imagining the anxiety or mischief that might have prompted the emphasis. Lewis, peering over my shoulder, remarked that some of the correspondence suggested academic rivalries and minor grievances, yet he seemed unaware of the intricate layering of human emotion these letters conveyed. I read a few aloud, softly, more for the cadence of thought than for immediate comprehension, noticing the ways certain phrases echoed the rhythm of poetic lines I had encountered elsewhere. The letters, I realized, were not merely communication, they were instruments of tension, a network of veiled declarations and silences that required delicate unraveling. Among the pile, a folded note of particularly pale paper drew my attention. Its edges were slightly browned, and a faint fingerprint marred one corner, almost imperceptibly. The text, written in precise, deliberate script, contained a reference to an old rehearsal in which Carmichael had purportedly insisted on a minor but significant alteration to the music. Something about the phrasing, the specificity of a detail that should have been trivial, caught in my mind as a clue whose relevance had not yet emerged but would, I suspected, later illuminate more than it revealed. A small framed photograph leaned against the wall beside the desk, a group of young choristers smiling stiffly, their expressions attempting joviality but betraying the usual tensions of learned youth. One figure, slightly apart from the rest, had the same faint furrow above the brow that I had noticed in Carmichael himself. I wondered, as I often did, about the silent legacies carried in posture, in gesture, in the things left unspoken. The photograph, the letters, the forgotten notations formed a lattice of memory, pride and rivalry, subtle enough to elude casual attention, yet dense with the potential for revelation. I filed each observation, each hesitation, as one might sort through the notes of a symphony before the first chord is struck. Lewis remained attentive but practical, missing the subtle clues embedded in inflections and shadows. I left the room with the feeling of threads yet unconnected, of a melody half heard in the cloisters, a harmony whose final resolution would demand patience, silence, and a quiet persistence in noticing what others might dismiss as inconsequential. In Oxford, it seemed, the past never fully settled, and the faintest trace of a letter could carry the weight of a secret yet untold. The chapel's library was quiet to the point of reverence, the sort of stillness that pressed against the eardrum and invited every creak of a floorboard to be noted. I moved slowly between the tall shelves, the scent of old parchment and polish lingering faintly, a reminder of centuries compressed into dust and leather. The choir's hymn books were arranged with meticulous order, yet one caught my eye, slightly skewed, its spine just off enough to suggest it had been recently handled or replaced. I pulled it gently, and a single note, folded with care, slipped from between the pages. The paper was thin, its edges curling as though it had absorbed the damp of Oxford air. I unfolded it, the script precise and deliberate, yet there was a slant, a tremor, in the stroke of one signature that suggested more than mere haste, it suggested tension. Lewis, standing unobtrusively behind me, remarked that a misplaced note was hardly evidence, yet I noticed the way he hesitated over the word misplaced, as though it had lodged in his mind with unanticipated significance. The note itself referenced a rehearsal, a time when a chord had been altered, not out of error, but of insistence, and concluded with the cryptic remark, "Do not let it be forgotten." The phrase lingered in my mind like a line from a poem half remembered, and I wondered how many in the choir had seen it, and what they had chosen to overlook. Even the choice of ink, slightly darker in certain areas, hinted at pauses, deliberation, and perhaps anxiety. I placed the note carefully back between the pages, marking its position mentally. Subtlety is often the companion of truth. A misfiled book, an annotation, a gesture. These are the instruments by which secrets are maintained or betrayed. A small pencil mark on the margin, almost invisible, caught my eye. It was a single letter, underlined, a detail that might have seemed trivial to anyone else, but to me suggested a reference to an older notation elsewhere, a connection that demanded attention even if its significance had not yet emerged. It was, in effect, a clue camouflaged in routine. The organist, passing by, paused briefly, glancing at the shelves with a fleeting curiosity that belied his composed exterior. He did not handle the note, yet his posture betrayed a subtle shift, a micro-gesture that might have gone unnoticed had I not been attuned to the orchestra of small motions. In Oxford, even the briefest hesitation or glance carries meaning, as if the stones themselves register human intent and memory. Lewis, perhaps unaware, remarked on the neatness of the library, but I found the disorder, however slight, far more compelling. I wandered to the chapel pews, noting the way the hymn books had been handled, the fingerprints along the edges, the faint creases of pages repeatedly consulted and returned. A small annotation on a separate score mirrored the notation I had observed in the mislaid note, a repetition that could easily be dismissed as coincidence, but for my habitual suspicion that no detail is entirely trivial. The choir members had been careful, cautious, yet there was a rhythm in their errors, an almost musical pattern of concealment that suggested not chaos, but intentional obfuscation. When we left, the library returned to silence, the faint light of dusk filtering through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the floor. I carried the image of the note in my mind, a singular hinge upon which the broader narrative might pivot. Oxford seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that small gestures, slight misplacements, and overlooked annotations might carry the weight of revelation. And I knew, as always, that the truth would reveal itself slowly in the patience of observation and the quiet attention paid to what others deem insignificant. The organ loft smelled faintly of varnish and dust, a heavy, almost tangible presence that seemed to linger in every crevice of the chapel. I ascended the narrow staircase slowly, each step creaking underfoot, and felt the hush of the space settle over me, thick with the memory of countless rehearsals, each note a whisper absorbed by stone and shadow. The organ itself, enormous and silent now, gleamed dimly in the waning light, its pedals worn smooth from generations of fingers, its pipes standing like mute sentinels. There was a history in its absence of sound, a silence that could contain secrets if one listened closely enough. Lewis lingered near the threshold, careful not to disturb the atmosphere, yet I was drawn to the subtle irregularities, the small details that often betray more than any confession. A thin layer of dust had been disturbed along the lower pedal board, a faint smear where the air itself seemed to have been pressed aside. A scratch, barely perceptible, ran along the edge of the bench. I crouched, letting my eye trace the trajectory of each mark. The gestures suggested movement, deliberate but hesitant, as if someone had been navigating in uncertainty or perhaps in concealment. The precision of intention was evident, yet the nervous quality betrayed unease. A choir member had reported voices in the loft the night before Carmichael's death, hushed but urgent. I imagined them now, the sound barely rising above a whisper, the exchange of words that could not be overheard from the nave. The tenor's presence seemed to linger, a ghostly echo in the wooden panels. A loose sheet of music lay partially hidden beneath the bench, its annotations faint but deliberate. One chord had been circled, another underlined, as though marking a moment of tension, a point of contention. I noted the peculiarity of the repeated emphasis on a minor alteration that seemed insignificant to anyone else. In puzzles and crosswords I had often noticed that the smallest letter out of place could mislead a solver here. A small mark might mislead the unobservant as well. The organist, a visiting scholar, passed without comment, his steps measured, careful not to disturb the instruments. Yet I observed a slight smudge on the cuff of his sleeve, near the wrist, as if he had brushed against the pedal-board or a page of the score, and a brief hesitation in his gaze that suggested calculation. The micro-expressions mattered, the small inflections of body and eye that betray internal logic before speech. Lewis asked me why I lingered, and I could only reflect that understanding often arises in quiet attention, not in hurried inspection. I crouched beside the bench, tracing the subtle disturbances, the lines left behind by movement, and imagined the scene of someone navigating in tension, glancing toward the nave, notes shuffled in haste, fingers brushing against wood and page. Each detail, minor though it appeared, layered itself into a narrative of presence, anxiety, and unspoken motives. It was the sort of deduction that requires patience, the slow weaving together of observation, memory, and intuition. Descending, I glanced back at the organ, its silent pipes reflecting the dim light like so many eyes, watching and remembering. The air outside was heavy with mist, the chapel below cloaked in shadow, yet I carried the faint outlines of movement, of gestures that would later inform the truth. Oxford has a way of embedding secrets in its architecture, in its instruments, in the spaces where music lingers in memory. And in that silence I felt the faint pulse of revelation, a shadow waiting to be traced. By the time I had reviewed the statements and examined the small evidence, an initial theory began to present itself, plausible and neat in its simplicity, yet I sensed the danger in embracing it too quickly. Carmichael's death, I considered, might have resulted from a miscalculated act of rivalry, a moment of professional jealousy made fatal by carelessness or impatience. The tenor's relationship with a fellow chorister, one of the younger tenors, had been strained for months, small irritations compounded by shared ambition and minor slights in rehearsals. On paper, it all seemed to align an argument overheard, a mislaid score, a glance too sharp. Even Lewis, cautiously optimistic, seemed inclined toward this solution, noting that motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence formed a tidy triangle. I walked once more through the chapel, listening to the echoes, noting the subtle depressions in the stone floor where footsteps had lingered, and the faint scuff marks along the edges of the music stands. Each minor detail suggested movement, presence, a sequence of events that could be interpreted to support the initial theory. One of the tenors had admitted to being near the organ loft the previous evening, ostensibly to retrieve a sheet of music, but leaving gaps in the narrative that hinted at agitation or concealment. I filed the admission with a practiced eye, aware that it seemed to corroborate the theory, even as small inconsistencies pricked at my attention. Yet, as I revisited the scene in my mind, I noted things that did not entirely fit. A chair slightly out of place, a pencil smudge in an unusual location, and the tenor's offhand reference to a rehearsal adjustment that had never been mentioned before, small, almost trivial, but enough to make me hesitate. In crosswords, I knew, a seemingly perfect solution often contains a misprint or an overlooked clue here. The neat alignment of motive and opportunity felt similarly suspect, the edges not quite matching the whole picture. The temptation to accept the obvious explanation was strong, yet the unease persisted, subtle and unyielding. Interviews continued, each chorister adding fragments, some contradicting others, some offering confessions of minor grievances, all laced with the careful tone of self-preservation. The organist's calm deflection, the director's measured concern, the soprano's quiet vigilance, all contributed to a tableau that superficially reinforced the theory. Yet I noticed the micro-gestures, a shoulder tension, a twitch of the lips, a hesitation before speaking. Such small behaviours often betray more than words can, yet they were easily overlooked by those seeking the comfort of simplicity. I spent the evening in reflection, walking the wet quadrangle beneath the lamplight, considering the sequence of events, noting how the first solution appeared satisfying because it was tidy and immediate, not because it was true. The city was silent, save for the distant toll of a bell and the faint shuffle of leaves in a light breeze. Each echo seemed to reinforce my awareness that the truth might reside in the details overlooked in the eagerness for resolution. Oxford, with its shadows and whispering corridors, suggested that what seems obvious is rarely so. The first solution, elegant and persuasive though it was, carried the faint tang of error, a subtle misdirection that I knew would have to be unravelled before the real pattern emerged. The evening settled over the college like a slow tide, the corridors dimly lit and echoing with the quiet shuffle of footsteps. I returned to the chapel with Lewis, noting again the creaking floorboards that seemed to record the passage of every thoughtless step. The choir members had been gathered reluctantly in the nave, their eyes lowered, gestures guarded. Confessions emerged, though none fully satisfied the demands of truth. Each admission was partial, shaded by caution, self-preservation, or a lingering pride that refused complete disclosure. The tenor who had seemed most agitated revealed he had confronted Carmichael over a minor rehearsal dispute, yet he avoided the precise nature of the disagreement, leaving a gap in the narrative that felt deliberately placed. Eleanor, the soprano, spoke softly of arguments overheard, yet she phrased her recollection in ways that suggested careful omission. A slight quiver in her voice, a glance toward the organist, betrayed layers beneath her words, as though she was both witness and participant in a network of subtle tensions. Mrs. Harcourt contributed her observations with an air of cultivated reserve, each sentence measured, avoiding judgment, yet hinting at her own unease with what she had not articulated in the immediate aftermath. I listened, as I often did, not merely for the content but for the rhythm of disclosure, the cadence, the pauses, the hesitation that could betray more than the words themselves. One minor detail struck me with the sudden clarity of a half-remembered crossword clue. The ink smudge on the rehearsal ledger, previously dismissed as incidental, aligned perfectly with the timing of one chorister's movement. It suggested the note had been handled deliberately, the smudge incidental only to the casual observer. In isolation, the observation might have been inconsequential, yet within the tapestry of partial confessions it flickered with significance, a small signpost toward understanding motives and concealed actions. Lewis, absorbed in recording statements, did not notice the alignment, yet I filed it meticulously, trusting that such nuances would accumulate into clarity. The organist, composed and deliberate, offered a partial admission of presence on the balcony during the final rehearsal, yet omitted the reason for remaining alone and the precise handling of scores. His gesture, a brief hesitation as he shifted his weight, a subtle tightening of his hand around a folded sheet, suggested more than he was willing to articulate. In Oxford, the smallest gesture can echo with meaning, and I attended to it as carefully as I would a line of poetry, noting the dissonance between posture and speech. By the time we withdrew from the nave, the air was heavy with unsaid things, the chapel imbued with a quiet tension that seemed to hum beneath the stone vaults. The confessions, though partial and evasive, had begun to sketch outlines of relationships, rivalries, and unspoken grievances. Each fragment, each half-truth, was a note in a melody yet to be fully discerned. I walked the damp quadrangle afterward, the lamplight reflecting faintly on wet stones, pondering how the truth often surfaces not in declarations, but in the spaces between them, in what is omitted, in the gestures that accompany words. Oxford seemed to absorb the confessions, turning them into shadows of understanding, subtle and incomplete, yet pregnant with possibility. The night carried the echoes of voices, the faint rustle of paper, and the muted recollections of those who had confessed only half of what they knew. In these shadows I sensed the path forward, delicate and precise, a route illuminated not by certainty, but by the patient recognition of what others left unspoken. The library archives of St. Barnabas's College have always held a peculiar weight, the smell of parchment mingling with candle smoke and the faint trace of centuries of scholars' contemplations. That day I moved among the tall, narrow shelves, the light from the high windows falling in muted streaks across the worn wooden floors. Each step produced a hollow echo, as if the stones themselves remembered every secret, every whispered conversation ever held in these corridors. I was drawn, almost instinctively, to a small collection of manuscripts, documents and letters that seemed almost forgotten, their edges fraying with age, the ink faded but deliberate. In that quiet I discovered a poem, coded in a manner both meticulous and cryptic, penned decades earlier by a chorister who had once inhabited these same rooms. The verses were ostensibly about harmony and voice, yet beneath the surface lay references to rivalry, betrayal, and secrets long concealed. The careful arrangement of initials, the repetition of particular words, hinted at a hidden narrative, an undercurrent of tension that had persisted across generations. I traced the letters with a finger, noting the subtle irregularities, the faint smudge that might have been accidental or deliberate, and wondered how many had seen it and ignored its significance. Lewis, standing slightly behind, asked quietly if this was relevant to Carmichael, and I could only muse that past and present often intertwine in Oxford in ways that defy neat categorization. The poem, though written long before, contained the same obsessive attention to detail, the same careful weighting of meaning that marked the interactions of the current choir members. A line in particular, misquoted deliberately, echoed a rehearsal dispute I had previously observed. The misquotation, I realized, was a small marker, a link between generations, suggesting that certain patterns of pride, resentment, and rivalry are rarely new, they persist, quietly, through time. I compared the annotations in Carmichael's manuscripts with the coded poem, noting that both employed similar flourishes, marginalia, and underlined phrases. There was a rhythm, almost musical, to the arrangement, as though the past had whispered its logic to the present. The archivist, watching unobtrusively, mentioned in passing that the poem had been considered a curiosity, not a warning, yet I could not ignore the alignment of symbols and phrases with the subtle gestures I had observed among the choir. A single, overlooked annotation shift in ink tone on a particular line suggested that the document had been handled in a specific, deliberate way, possibly as a signal or reminder. Outside, the quadrangle was shrouded in mist, the bell tower tolling faintly as though keeping time with my reflection. Oxford seemed to exhale around me, the quiet streets and cloistered arches absorbing the resonance of histories and echoes. I understood, as I often did in such moments, that the present cannot be fully disentangled from what has come before. The motives, the pride, the jealousies they reverberate, sometimes decades later, manifesting in disputes over a note, a rehearsal, or a subtle gesture. I filed the observation carefully, noting the continuity of human emotion, the enduring patterns that persist, even when the faces and names change. Leaving the archives, I felt the weight of both history and memory pressing gently against the present. The past is never truly past in Oxford. It lingers, faint but insistent, in the margin of a poem, the crease of a sheet, the echo of a voice that has long since fallen silent. And in these echoes I sensed the faint outlines of truths yet to be revealed, waiting for the patient observer to discern their quiet, persistent rhythm. It was in the quiet of my flat that the next theory first took shape, insidious in its simplicity, yet beguiling in its apparent logic. I traced the sequence of movements, statements, and minor discrepancies, each one aligning with an interpretation that seemed, at first, convincing. The visiting organ scholar, whose presence in the loft the night of Carmichael's death had been noted but unexplained, now appeared to fit the role of culprit. Motive, opportunity, and circumstantial evidence formed a tidy lattice, and I could see how anyone might accept it without hesitation. The scholar's movements were circumscribed, precise to the point of ritual. He had been observed handling the rehearsal scores, lingering near the pedals and glancing repeatedly toward the nave. One of the choristers had noted, almost in passing, that his shadow had lingered in a particular corner longer than decorum required, a detail that seemed insignificant until re-examined. I recalled the pencil mark on the edge of a music sheet, a faint smudge that could easily be attributed to routine handling. The alignment of these minor observations suggested deliberate interference, a narrative almost too neat in its arrangement. Yet as I considered the tenor of the scholar's interactions, I noticed nuances that pricked at my certainty. A slight hesitation before responding to a question, a micro-expression that hinted at calculation rather than guilt, a curling of the fingers as he adjusted his cuff-small, almost imperceptible, yet dissonant when contrasted with the otherwise orderly tableau. The human body betrays more than words, I reminded myself, and in these subtle cues I found the first fissures in the otherwise solid theory. Lewis, enthusiastic at the prospect of a clear resolution, pressed me for judgment, yet I lingered over these nuances. The alignment was too convenient, the logic too elegant, and the details, once isolated, did not cohere fully. It reminded me of crossword puzzles, where an apparent solution satisfies most entries, but leaves one corner unresolved, a single letter misaligned, an element that refuses to conform to the rest. The scholar's guilt fit neatly into the majority of the narrative, yet one minor contradiction, the date on a marginal note, the angle of a footstep, the placement of a score, suggested that the apparent simplicity masked a more complex truth. Interviews continued, each participant providing fragments that reinforced the misdirection, the half-truths folding into the neat lattice of this second false solution. The organist's calm assertions, the carefully measured glances of the choir members, even the director's controlled exhalations, all contributed to the illusion. The small details, the way a page had been turned, a ledger slightly askew, a smudge on the edge of ink, though almost imperceptible, began to flicker in my mind, signalling a hidden inconsistency. By nightfall, the city lay under mist, and the spires of Oxford reflected dimly in wet streets. I sat in quiet reflection, noting that the second false solution, though satisfying in its tidiness, carried the unmistakable scent of artifice. It was elegant, persuasive, and dangerously misleading, and I understood that the truth would not be found in what was obvious, but in the overlooked, the marginal, the half-noticed gestures that might otherwise escape attention. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, and I knew the final, subtle revelation would emerge only through patient observation, a careful threading together of the shadows that now obscured what had seemed so clear. It was in the quiet hours of the morning, with the fog still pressing against the stone facades of the college, that the pattern finally began to emerge, fragile and precise, like the first faint strains of a hymn half remembered. I revisited the chapel alone, the air still damp from overnight drizzle, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and polished wood. The pews were empty, the organ silent, and the scattered hymn sheets lay as they had been left, a subtle disorder that now seemed charged with meaning rather than chaos. I traced my fingers along the edge of a bench, noting a faint indentation where a score had been pressed, the curve suggesting the angle of a hurried hand rather than mere placement. The minor details, almost imperceptible, coalesced the ink smudge on a rehearsal note, the slight misquotation of a line in a hymn book, the delicate fold in a page that no one had noticed. Each gesture, each mark had been recorded in my mind over the previous days, catalogued like the entries of a meticulous ledger. They pointed toward the pianist, whose movements during rehearsals had always been subtle yet deliberate, whose interactions carried the undercurrent of both pride and apprehension. There was a hesitancy in her step, a precise avoidance of certain glances, and the manner in which she handled the scores suggested a concern beyond mere musical interpretation. I thought of crosswords, of the way a seemingly insignificant letter can alter the meaning of an entire clue, and I applied the same patience to these accumulated observations. A chord circled in a rehearsal score, a comment scribbled in pencil, the precise moment when a hand had brushed against the organ, all seemed trivial in isolation, but in conjunction composed a narrative of intent. The pieces aligned not through grand gestures or overt confession, but through the quiet manipulation of circumstance, the careful orchestration of appearance. The hymn, forgotten at first, was remembered in the smallest acts, the positioning of scores, the subtle timing of steps, the careful concealment of what should have been obvious. I recalled Eleanor's fleeting expressions, Mrs. Harcourt's measured concern, the tenor's half-acknowledged agitation. Each contributed to the underlying texture, but it was in the pianist's gestures that the final clue had always lingered, hidden in plain sight. I noted how she had handled the rehearsal notes, the faint smudge that had escaped attention, the alignment of one marginal annotation with an older hymn reference, all converging toward an understanding that was elegant in its quiet inevitability. The truth, as always, resided in the minutiae, in the patterns that the casual observer might dismiss, but which, to a careful eye, spelled the narrative with crystalline clarity. As I traced the arrangement of the hymn sheets one last time, the memory of the first rehearsal, the first disruptions, and the small gestures that had seemed inconsequential now resonated with full significance. Oxford itself seemed to exhale, the fog softening the outlines of the spire, the silence deepening the resonance of revelation. The choir would resume, the hymn would be sung, yet the echoes of what had transpired lingered, subtle and enduring. I left the chapel with the sensation that for once the melody was complete, the notes accounted for, yet still carrying the quiet ache of human ambition, rivalry, and the fragile persistence of truth. The chapel had returned to its accustomed calm, the echoes of rehearsals and whispered tensions now absorbed by stone and shadow, leaving only the faint trace of what had transpired. I walked slowly along the damp quadrangle, the lamplight glimmering on the slick flagstones, each reflection a faint memory of gestures, notes, and unspoken words. The choir, now reshaped by revelation, yet still bound to the rhythms of tradition, resumed in subdued manner, a hymn whispered into the corners of the vaulted space, precise yet carrying the weight of remembrance. There was a careful order to their movements, as though the past, while acknowledged, was now held at a measured distance, visible but not intrusive. Lewis followed, methodical in his observations, remarking quietly on the return to normality, Yet I could detect in his tone a lingering tension, a recognition that resolution often leaves as many questions in its wake as it dispels. The pianist, whose subtle manipulations had shaped much of the unfolding drama, now moved with a faint air of relief, tempered by residual vigilance, as though the act of being seen had altered her comfort irrevocably. The organist, still composed, traced his hands over the keys in absent reflection, fingers remembering sequences that had played out in tension and silence. Each of these movements, ordinary on the surface, carried undercurrents I catalogued with quiet attention. I lingered on a bench near the rear, observing the slight asymmetries in posture, the angles of gaze, the subtle ways in which emotion manifests in restraint. A glance toward a folded hymn sheet revealed a crease that had persisted since the first rehearsal, unnoticed by others but significant in its constancy, a signpost of habitual handling and intentional placement. I considered the chain of events, the misdirections, the false solutions, and the minor gestures that had shaped perception. Each fragment, though partial, had converged into a narrative discernible only through patient attention, an understanding that emerged in silence rather than announcement. The air carried a faint chill, the scent of wet stone mingled with wax polish, and I noted the distant toll of the college bell, its resonance tracing time in quiet increments. Oxford seemed to exhale around me, the spires and cloisters imbued with an enduring memory, a repository of acts large and small, spoken and unspoken. I reflected on the delicate balance of pride and vulnerability, the quiet persistence of ambition and error, and the enduring subtlety with which human nature operates. In this space, truth is rarely explosive. It reveals itself in the nuanced, the overlooked, the gestures that linger in memory. Leaving the chapel, I felt the weight of observation settle with me, a companion as insistent as the fog curling along the quadrangle. The city beyond the gates was muted, the streets glistening under a thin sheen of rain, and the distant sound of footsteps carried like faint counterpoints to the reverberations of the morning's revelations. I understood, as I often do in such postludes, that resolution carries its own cadence, a subtle harmony of closure, an ongoing reflection. The hymn had been remembered, the facts aligned, yet the quiet ache of insight lingered, a reminder that even in the resolution of events, Oxford retains its shadows, its echoes, and the intricate layering of human intention that will never fully be untangled. I returned to my flat that evening with the weight of the past days pressing quietly against my shoulders, the streets of Oxford slick and reflective beneath the soft drizzle, their lamplight like scattered stars fallen to the earth. Inside, the familiar scents of old books, pipe tobacco, and varnished wood welcomed me, yet even here the echoes of the chapel and the choir lingered, faint and persistent. I sat by the window, tracing the patterns of rain against the glass, thinking of the delicate interweaving of gesture, note, and omission that had finally revealed the truth. It was a revelation not loud or triumphant, but quiet, elegant, and inexorably precise. The letters, the annotations, the minor disturbances each had accumulated in my mind like a complex symphony, subtle dissonances harmonizing only when examined in the totality of context. I recalled the minor smudge on the score, the pencil mark in the margin, Eleanor's fleeting expressions, the organist's controlled hesitation, and the pianist's deliberate handling of the sheets. Each detail, seemingly trivial in isolation, had acted as a thread, weaving the narrative across rehearsals, confessions, and historical echoes. It struck me, as it so often does in these cases, that the smallest gesture can carry more weight than the most elaborate argument. Lewis called briefly, his voice punctuated with the usual mixture of procedural efficiency and quiet curiosity, remarking that the choir had resumed rehearsals and that outwardly order had returned. I listened, noting the calm in his tone, and replied with a reflection on the subtlety of human pride, on the small ways that ambition and error persist even when appearances suggest resolution. He did not linger, understanding perhaps that in cases such as this the work of observation continues long after formal inquiry ends. Even when the external world resumes its rhythm, the inner ledger of gestures, notes, and silences remains open for study. I gazed across the flat at the stack of papers I had yet to catalogue fully, the remnants of marginalia, and the faint impressions of ink on adjacent sheets. A line misquoted, a page folded, a trace of a fingerprint, each a signal, small but deliberate, that had been overlooked by others but inscribed in memory. In this there is a peculiar poetry, a recognition that truth does not always announce itself. It waits, patient, in the interstices of observation, for one sufficiently attuned to perceive it. Oxford itself seems to preserve these moments, the stone and wood absorbing intention and recalling it to those willing to note its faint reverberations. The city outside darkened further, the fog thickening, the distant toll of a bell marking time with soft insistence. I sipped my whisky, the warmth a quiet companion to thought, and allowed myself to dwell on the echoes left behind pride, rivalry, error, and the ephemeral harmonies of human intention. Even as the case resolved itself in external terms, the memory of subtle gestures, the interplay of historical resonance and present action, and the continuing resonance of those small, precise clues lingered. The hymn had been remembered, the notes aligned, yet the ache of comprehension, the delicate awareness of human complexity, remained. I set down the glass, watching the mist curl around the spire across the street, and felt the familiar ache of insight tempered by the quiet melancholy that Oxford imparts. There is a satisfaction in understanding, yes, but it is always accompanied by the awareness that truth is never entirely held. It is a melody, sometimes fleeting, sometimes lingering, but never fully claimed. In that sense, even in closure, the city and the choir and its shadows remain, quietly insisting upon attention, patience, and reverent observation.